If you had stepped through the gates of London in the summer of 1348, the first thing that would have happened is not what the movies would have taught you to expect. You would have smelled it. Before you saw the walls, before you heard the market, before you understood where you were, the air itself would have reached out and laid a hand across your mouth. Rot, blood, smoke, wet straw, tallow, human filth baking in alleyways too narrow for sunlight, and underneath it all, the sweet, sickly thickness of a city trying to digest its own waste and failing. London packed perhaps 70 or 80,000 people into roughly 1 square mile, a human density that would not have looked out of place in a modern metropolis, except there was no underground sewer, no garbage collection, no protected reservoir, no hidden machinery carrying the consequences away. Civilization here sat on top of decomposition like a thin table balanced over a pit. The line between ordinary life and catastrophe could be measured in planks of wood, sometimes fewer. In the 1348, a man named Richard the Raker fell through the rotting wooden planks that covered his own cesspool and drowned in several feet of accumulated human waste. Not just his waste, but his neighbor's waste too, collected over what may have been years. And the thing that should genuinely disturb you about that story is that nobody treated it as unusual. Because it wasn't. Because that was just ordinary life in medieval England. That is the world you would have walked into if you'd been alive in 1348. The line between civilization and open sewage came down to a few planks of wood. Roughly 80% of the population spent their lives doing back-breaking agricultural labor. The concept of germs wouldn't exist for another 5 centuries, and the most sophisticated medical explanation for why millions of people were dying pointed to the planets being in the wrong position. You would not have survived any of this, and over the next several minutes I'm going to walk you through exactly why. Starting with the first thing you'd notice, the smell would hit you before anything else. London in 1348 held roughly 70 to 80,000 people packed inside a walled city of about 1 square mile, which gave it a population density comparable to modern Manhattan. Manhattan, of course, has plumbing, garbage collection, and a sewer system that doesn't empty into the same river people drink from. What London had was the Fleet River. The Fleet ran just west of the city walls and served simultaneously as a trade route, a source of drinking water, and an open sewer. Slaughterhouses dumped animal blood, bones, hides, and offal directly into it. Tanneries poured in chemical runoff, and latrines emptied into it from both banks. The lower portion eventually became so choked with filth that it earned the name the Fleet Ditch. But in 1348, it still technically qualified as a river. 60 years before the plague even arrived, the stench from the Fleet had already grown so overwhelming that a Carmelite prior, the Dominican friars, and the Bishop of Salisbury all signed a formal petition of complaint. A bishop wrote an official letter about how bad a river smelled, and that tells you something about the river. The authorities' solution in 1343 was to instruct butchers to dump their waste into the Fleet so that animal remains would stop accumulating in the streets. One historian dryly noted that this turned out to be less than ideal, and that was the baseline. Before the Black Death showed up, King Edward III himself wrote to the mayor of London in 1349, complaining that the streets were foul with human feces, and the air of the city poisoned to the great danger of anyone passing through, especially in a time of infectious disease. The King of England had to personally tell the mayor of his own capital city to clean up the human waste in the streets. That was your normal. Every single morning, pigs roamed freely through the streets of many towns, and these were not the plump pink animals you're imagining. Medieval pigs were smaller and closer in appearance to wild boars, with tusks and wiry hair and a temperament to match. They rooted up gardens, attacked passers-by, exhumed bodies from graveyards, and reportedly killed children. The Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony had special royal privileges allowing their pigs to wander the streets wearing little bells, which at least gave you a warning before a tusked animal charged you from an alley. And the city of Exeter had a stream running through it that carried the official name Shitbrook, not as slang, but on actual maps that people used for directions. Now let me take you inside a medieval home. Your toilet, if you were fortunate enough to live in a castle, went by the name garderobe, a small stone chamber projecting from the castle wall with a hole that dropped waste into the moat or a cesspit far below. The word garderobe translates to wardrobe, and clothing was stored near the toilet on purpose, because ammonia fumes from the accumulated waste below were believed to repel lice and fleas. Your best suit hung directly above a shaft of human excrement, by design. During the siege of Château Gaillard in France in 1204, enemy soldiers gained entry to the fortress by climbing up through a latrine shaft, which tells you everything about both the size of these openings and the determination of medieval armies. Commoners used a chamber pot at night and emptied it into the cesspit each morning. The relevant sanitation legislation consisted of an ordinance requiring you to shout "Look out below" 3 times before dumping a full chamber pot out the window and into the street. That was the actual law. Shout a warning 3 times, and then let gravity do the rest. Cesspits were supposed to sit at least 2.5 feet from your neighbor's property, if stone-lined, or 3.5 feet if they weren't. Seepage into neighboring properties and wells happened constantly. While one case from 1347 found 2 men who had been secretly piping their waste through a hidden channel into a neighbor's cellar, and nobody caught on until the cellar overflowed. Here's the thing about medieval hygiene that most people get completely wrong. The popular image of universally filthy medieval people who never bathed and wallowed in grime for decades at a stretch is mostly a myth, and I say mostly, because the reality turns out to be both more interesting and more tragic than the stereotype suggests. Medieval people washed daily in many cases. Cleaning your hands and face every morning was standard across all social classes. Etiquette manuals instructed people to keep their fingernails clean, avoid touching ears or nose with bare hands, and wipe their lips before drinking from a shared cup. Soap had arrived from the Middle East with returning crusaders as a luxury product, while common people made their own version from animal fat and wood ash. Linen undergarments did the heavy lifting of medieval hygiene by absorbing sweat and dirt, and the wealthy changed them every day. Public bathhouses operated everywhere across medieval Europe. 32 lined the streets of Paris by the 13th century. Southwark across the Thames from London had 18 hot baths. Vienna had 29, and Nuremberg boasted 14, earning a reputation as one of the cleanest cities on the continent. Even small towns often ran a bathhouse connected to the local bakery, sharing heat from the bread ovens. A 12th century writer named Alexander Neckham reported being woken up by street criers shouting that the baths were hot. Medieval illustrations show people sitting in large wooden tubs with boards laid across them as dining tables, eating and socializing while they soaked. And the 14th century Italian physician Maino de Maineri catalogued 57 different ways to take a bath. The man had strong opinions about bathing. Some of those bathhouses, particularly the famous Southwark stews, doubled as brothels. The sex workers who operated there went by the name Winchester geese, because the stews were licensed and regulated by the Bishop of Winchester. And a 15th century document laid out 39 rules governing their operation. The medieval church regulated both your spiritual hygiene and the hygiene of your local brothel with equal bureaucratic enthusiasm. Monks themselves had a more complicated relationship with water. Most monastic orders limited full baths to 2 or 3 times per year to avoid the sin of vanity and bodily indulgence. St. Benedict's rule declared that bathing shall seldom be permitted to those who are well, especially the young. St. Francis of Assisi went further and considered an unwashed body a stinking badge of piety. And yet monastic bathhouses existed all over, with Cluny Abbey maintaining one that held 12 tubs and 45 toilet cubicles, while Canterbury's Christ Church Monastery had piped water running to its kitchen, washhouse and infirmary from settling tanks as early as 1150. The church was simultaneously suspicious of bathing and professionally committed to plumbing. Across the Mediterranean, the Islamic world operated on an entirely different level. 10th century Córdoba under Islamic rule held a population of over 500,000, with street lighting, running water, and 300 public bathhouses, all at a time when London had roughly 10,000 inhabitants using the Thames as both water supply and toilet. The Hadith declared cleanliness to be half of faith, and Muslims performed ritual washing 5 times daily before prayer. Arab physicians had dedicated entire chapters of their medical texts to hygiene, soap-making, deodorants, and toothpaste. Crusaders who traveled to the Holy Land were described by Arab writers as having a total disregard for personal hygiene, with their noblest knights reportedly boasting about bathing no more than 4 times a year. Medieval Europeans were not the unwashed savages of popular imagination, but compared to their Islamic contemporaries, they lagged far behind. And what makes all of this tragic rather than just colorful is that they genuinely tried. They cared about cleanliness. They pursued it, and they built infrastructure around it. None of that mattered, because the one thing they lacked, the one thing that would have actually saved them, was any understanding of what was really making them sick. Disease in 1348 was explained through 3 frameworks, and all 3 were wrong. The first was humoral theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks, which held that your body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health meant balance while sickness meant one humor had grown out of proportion. Treatment meant restoring that balance through bloodletting, purging, or induced vomiting. The second framework was miasma theory, the belief that corrupt or poisonous air rising from rotting matter, swamps, or unclean environments caused disease. That belief explains why people carried bouquets of flowers pressed to their noses, why homes were fumigated with burning herbs and incense, and why pomanders, small scented balls of herbs and spices, were worn around the neck. Floors got scattered with rushes and aromatic herbs like basil, chamomile, lavender, mint, and rosemary, all to mask the smells. It wasn't superstition exactly, because it followed a kind of logic. Rotting things smell bad, sick people smell bad, and places with bad smells have more sick people. The conclusion that bad air causes disease made sense from the evidence available, even though it was completely wrong. The third framework was the simplest and the most psychologically devastating of all. God was angry. You sinned, and this plague was your punishment. In October of 1348, King Philip VI of France commissioned the medical faculty of the University of Paris, the most prestigious medical institution in Europe, to produce an official report on what was causing the plague. 49 of the finest medical minds on the continent put their heads together and concluded that a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius on March 20, 1345, had corrupted the atmosphere. Drawing on Aristotle, they explained that Jupiter's hot and moist nature combined with Mars had caused rot and putrefaction in the air itself, and this report became the single most widely circulated and authoritative medical explanation of the plague across all of Europe. The people at highest risk, according to these 49 experts, included those bunged up with evil humors, people following a bad lifestyle with too much exercise, sex, and bathing, persistent worriers, and corpulent people with a ruddy complexion. If you were overweight and anxious, the University of Paris had all but declared you a dead man walking. Treatments matched the understanding perfectly. Bloodletting, meaning a doctor would open a vein and drain your blood, stood as the most common medical intervention for almost any illness. Plague buboes got lanced or cauterized with a hot iron. One popular remedy called the Vicary method involved placing a live chicken's bare rump directly against the swollen bubo to draw out the poison. Theriac, a compound of up to 80 ingredients including myrrh, cinnamon, and opiates, had been considered a universal antidote since antiquity. Four Thieves vinegar circulated as another supposed cure. Prayer rounded out the options. None of it worked. Guy de Chauliac, personal physician to Pope Clement the Sixth and one of the most respected surgeons in Europe, wrote with devastating honesty that physicians felt useless and ashamed because they did not dare visit the sick for fear of infection. And when they did visit them, they could do very little and accomplished nothing. Chauliac himself contracted the plague, suffering a continuous fever and a bubo in the groin, and somehow became one of the rare few to survive. He had advised the Pope to keep fires burning continuously in his chambers, which may have unknowingly helped repel fleas. Another physician named Raymond Chalin Divinario recognized that bloodletting was completely useless against the plague, but continued prescribing it anyway, admitting that he reserved the treatment specifically for members of the Roman Curia whom he disliked. That might be the most honest thing a doctor has ever said. And the iconic plague doctor costume, the beak mask filled with dried flowers and herbs, didn't exist yet. A French physician named Charles Delorme wouldn't invent it until 1619, and the famous engraving of Dr. Beak dates to 1656. Only two physical examples of the masks have ever been found, both from 17th century Germany. If you're picturing a sinister figure in a bird mask looming over your sickbed, you're about 3 centuries too early. In 1348, your doctor just showed up with a knife and a chicken. The medicine was spectacularly bad, and I truly cannot emphasize that enough. But we haven't even gotten to what you were eating and drinking yet, and that's worth staying for. London's primary water supply ran through the Great Conduit, authorized in 1236, a system of lead and timber pipes stretching roughly 3 to 4 miles from springs at Tyburn to a cistern in Cheapside. 12 conduit systems served the city by the mid-14th century, with water dispensed from taps and hand-delivered to residences by workers called water cobs for a fee. That infrastructure was genuinely impressive for the era. The problem was that the same rivers and streams feeding the water supply were also receiving the output of cesspools, latrines, slaughterhouses, and tanneries, with no separation between clean water and wastewater at all. You were drinking downstream from your own toilet. Despite what you've heard, medieval people did not drink beer instead of water, because the water was too dangerous. Historians have documented extensive evidence of routine water consumption, and health manuals recommended drinking from cool springs. About 90% of Europe's population lived in rural areas with easy access to clean streams. Ale was widely consumed, but primarily as a calorie-rich supplement for laborers rather than a water replacement. And medieval ales contained roughly 1% alcohol compared to 5% in a modern beer. You weren't safely getting drunk instead of drinking the water. You were just drinking the water. The myth that medieval people used spices to mask the taste of rotten meat is also wrong. Wealthy people who could afford exotic spices could easily afford fresh meat, while the poor who might eat questionable meat couldn't remotely afford spices. And laws existed punishing merchants who sold spoiled food with time in the public stocks. Food safety had its own genuine nightmares, though. Ergotism, known as St. Anthony's fire, came from a fungus called Claviceps purpurea that grew on rye grain, especially after cold or wet winters. And contaminated bread could trigger convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene of the extremities, and death. Rye was a staple across medieval Europe, which meant every single day when you ate bread, you were rolling the dice. Your teeth, oddly enough, represent one of the few areas where medieval people had it better than you'd expect. Only about 20% of medieval teeth show any sign of decay in the archaeological record, compared to up to 90% in early 20th century populations. And the reason comes down to an almost total absence of sugar in the diet. People cleaned their teeth with rough linen cloths, hazel twigs, and herbal powders made from sage, rosemary, pepper, and salt, while Guy de Chauliac himself recommended removing excess calculus and using antiseptic gargles. Gerald of Wales noted that Welsh peasants rubbed their teeth until they shone like ivory. The bigger problem was tooth wear from eating stone-ground bread daily, with the grit slowly grinding enamel to nothing over a lifetime. When a real dental problem did develop, your options came down to a barber surgeon armed with pliers and no anesthetic, operating under the belief that tiny worms living inside the tooth caused cavities. Treatment involved holding a burning candle close to the tooth to smoke the worms out. Your teeth probably wouldn't rot, but everything else about medieval dentistry would make you wish they had. And it was into this world of cesspools and contaminated water, and fleet ditches and shitbrooks, and clothing hung above sewage shafts and rye bread that could give you gangrene, that the Black Death arrived.